You've seen the famous Vietnam War movies, but what if the ones you missed are the most disturbing? Why were these films ignored, despite showing the war more honestly than anything Hollywood celebrated? Some were buried, some were misunderstood, and some are so raw they're hard to sit through. In this video, you'll discover 8 Vietnam War films hiding on Netflix that reveal truths most stories avoid. But one of them crosses a line most war movies never dare. Danger Close, The Battle of Long Tan, 2019. There's a moment in war where strategy collapses and survival becomes instinct. Danger Close drops you into that exact moment with almost no warning. Set during the Battle of Long Tan, the film follows a small group of Australian soldiers who find themselves surrounded by a vastly larger enemy force. Outnumbered, outgunned, and completely cut off. What makes this film unsettling isn't just the scale of the danger, it's the precision of it. Every movement feels calculated, every decision carries weight, and every second stretches longer than it should. The jungle isn't just a backdrop, it's a trap. Visibility is low, communication is fractured, and the enemy is everywhere, and nowhere at the same time. Unlike many war films that glorify victory, this one focuses on endurance. You start to feel the pressure these soldiers were under, the confusion, the fear, the desperate reliance on artillery support that may or may not arrive in time. The film builds tension slowly, then refuses to release it. What's rarely talked about is how Danger Close strips away the idea of control. There's no grand plan unfolding here. Just a group of men trying to survive a situation that should have killed them, and that's what makes it linger. Because by the end, you're not thinking about who won the battle. You're thinking about how close they came to disappearing entirely, and how many stories like this were never told. Tigerland, 2000, Before the Jungle. Before the bullets, before the chaos. There was Tigerland. And what's disturbing is how the war begins long before soldiers ever leave American soil. This film doesn't show Vietnam itself. Instead, it traps you inside a training camp designed to break men down and rebuild them for a war many don't even believe in. The tension here isn't explosive, it's psychological. Every drill, every command, every punishment feels like a step closer to something irreversible. At the center is a soldier who refuses to fully submit. Not loud, not rebellious in the obvious way, but quietly resistant. And that's what makes him dangerous. Because in a system built on obedience, even hesitation becomes a threat. The film's power comes from what it doesn't show. You never see the battlefield, but you feel it approaching like a storm. The fear isn't of dying, it's of being transformed into someone capable of killing without question. And that transformation is already happening. What makes Tigerland so overlooked is its restraint. There are no grand battle scenes, no cinematic explosions, just slow, creeping dread. The realization that by the time these men reach Vietnam, the war has already changed them. And maybe that's the point. The real damage doesn't start in combat. It starts here, in silence, in pressure, in the quiet moments where identity begins to slip away.
Wilson! Right.
Hamburger Hill, 1987. Some battles aren't remembered for victory. They're remembered for what they cost. Hamburger Hill is one of those stories, and it doesn't try to make it easier to watch. From the beginning, the film throws you into repetition. Assault after assault. The same hill, the same objective, the same devastating outcome. And that repetition becomes the point. Because as the soldiers climb again and again, you start to question what they're really fighting for. There's no clean narrative here. No heroic arc guiding the story forward, just exhaustion, mud, confusion, orders that feel disconnected from reality. The enemy is present, but the real tension comes from the endless cycle. Attack, fail, regroup, repeat. What makes this film quietly disturbing is how it strips away meaning. The soldiers aren't chasing glory. They're following commands that seem to lead nowhere. And with each failed attempt, the cost becomes harder to justify. The performances lean into that fatigue. You see it in their faces, the slow realization that survival might depend less on bravery and more on luck. And even luck runs out. Hamburger Hill doesn't give you a satisfying conclusion. It leaves you with a question that lingers long after the credits roll. What happens when a battle is won, but nothing actually changes? Because in the end, the hill is taken, but the cost of taking it is something the film refuses to let you forget. Casualties of War, 1989. There are war films about survival. And then there are war films about what survives after morality is gone. Casualties of War doesn't ease you into its story. It forces you to confront a line being crossed in real time. Set within a U.S. platoon deep in Vietnam, the film follows a young soldier who becomes trapped in a situation far more disturbing than combat itself. What begins as a routine mission slowly mutates into something darker, something that reveals how quickly discipline can erode when authority goes unchecked. What makes this film so difficult to shake isn't the violence, it's the silence around it. Orders are given, men follow, and the few who hesitate are forced into a position where doing nothing becomes just as dangerous as speaking out. The tension builds not through action, but through moral pressure. But you feel it closing in. The jungle here isn't just a battlefield, it's isolation. Cut off from oversight, from consequence, from anything resembling structure, the soldiers begin to operate in a space where right and wrong blur into something unrecognizable. And that's where the film becomes deeply unsettling. The central conflict isn't between soldiers and enemy forces, it's internal. One man's refusal to accept what's happening places him at odds with his own unit. Loyalty becomes a weapon, conscience becomes a liability. What's often overlooked is how Casualties of War frames the aftermath. The war doesn't end when the mission is over. It follows the survivor back home, into memory, into guilt, into a reality where justice feels incomplete. Because the film isn't asking what happened in Vietnam. Here it's asking something far more uncomfortable. How many times did something like this happen, and no one spoke up?
We came with $1 a year, effectively, mills, and go back to India.
147 were wounded in weeks in Saigon.
The Fog of War, 2003. Most war stories are told from the battlefield. The Fog of War does something far more unsettling. It tells the story from the mind of the man who helped shape it. Through a series of controlled, almost clinical interviews, former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara reflects on decisions that affected millions of lives. There are no explosions here, no combat scenes, just words, and somehow that makes it heavier. What makes this documentary so gripping is the contrast. McNamara speaks with clarity, intelligence, even calmness. But the subject matter beneath those words carries immense weight. Strategy. Miscalculation, escalation. Each concept sounds logical until you realize the human cost behind it. The film is structured around lessons, but they don't feel like guidance. They feel like confessions, moments where hindsight exposes just how uncertain everything really was. The title itself becomes the central idea. The fog isn't just on the battlefield, it exists in decision-making, in perception, in understanding consequences too late. What's rarely discussed is how the film avoids easy judgment. It doesn't tell you how to feel. Instead, it lets the contradictions sit there, unresolved. A man who believed he was acting rationally, reflecting on outcomes that now seem anything but. And that's where the tension lives. Not in what is said, but in what can't be undone. Because by the end, you're left with a question that lingers far beyond Vietnam. What happens when the people making the biggest decisions aren't entirely sure they're right?
There's a wonderful phrase. I've been promoted when race.
I had become so 1973 and center of Canto.
Tiger.
Any trouble out there?
Last Days in Vietnam, 2014, the war didn't end with a final battle. It ended with chaos, with panic, with impossible choices. Last Days in Vietnam captures that unraveling with a level of urgency that feels almost suffocating. Set during the final days of April 1975, the documentary focuses on the evacuation of Saigon as North Vietnamese forces close in. But instead of presenting it as a coordinated withdrawal, the film reveals something far more fragile, a desperate, improvised effort to save as many lives as possible before time runs out. What makes this story gripping is the scale of uncertainty. Orders are unclear. Plans change by the hour. When officials on the ground are forced to make decisions that could determine who escapes and who is left behind. And there's never enough room, never enough time. The tension doesn't come from combat, it comes from waiting. From watching helicopters lift off, knowing there are still thousands who won't make it. From seeing individuals risk everything to help others, even when the system around them begins to collapse. The film also exposes the emotional weight of responsibility. Diplomats, soldiers, and civilians are all caught in a moment where duty and humanity collide. Following orders might mean abandoning people. Ignoring them might mean losing everything. What lingers most is the sense of finality. This isn't just the end of a war, it's the end of promises, alliances, and years of involvement that unravel in a matter of days. Because Last Days in Vietnam doesn't ask who won or lost. It asks something far more haunting when everything falls apart. Who gets to leave and who doesn't?
Hanoi suddenly about 4 in the morning. But what?
Rescue Dawn, 2006. There's a version of war that's loud, chaotic, and relentless. And then there's the version where everything goes silent, where survival becomes slow, painful, and uncertain. Rescue Dawn lives in that silence. Based on a true story, the film follows a U.S. pilot shot down over Laos and captured behind enemy lines. But this isn't a story about combat. It's about captivity, about endurance, about how long a human being can hold on to hope when everything around them is designed to break it. The prison camp is stripped down to its barest form. No grand structures, no cinematic spectacle. Just confinement, hunger, and the constant presence of fear. Time stretches, days blur together, and the idea of escape feels less like a plan and more like a fragile illusion. What makes Rescue Dawn so gripping is its unpredictability. Survival here isn't heroic, it's desperate. Every decision carries risk. Every attempt at resistance could make things worse. And yet, doing nothing guarantees a slow collapse. The film leans heavily into psychological tension. You begin to feel the weight of isolation, the pressure of uncertainty, the thin line between determination and delusion. The jungle outside the camp isn't freedom, it's another threat waiting to consume anyone who tries to run. And that's what lingers. Not the idea of escape, but the cost of it. Because Rescue Dawn isn't asking whether survival is possible. It's asking something far more unsettling. How much of yourself are you willing to lose just to stay alive?
All right! Above your head!
Da 5 Bloods, 2020. Most war films end when the soldiers come home. Da 5 Bloods begins there, and that's what makes it different. Decades after the Vietnam War, 4 black veterans returned to the country, searching for the remains of their fallen squad leader and a buried treasure they left behind. But what starts as a mission quickly turns into something far more complicated, because the past isn't buried, it's waiting. The film shifts between timelines, blending memories of war with the present-day journey. And as those two worlds collide, the emotional weight becomes impossible to ignore. These men didn't just fight a war overseas, they carried it back with them, shaping who they became long after the shooting stopped. What makes Da 5 Blood stand out is its perspective. It doesn't just revisit Vietnam, it questions it. It explores loyalty, injustice, and the feeling of fighting for a country that didn't always fight for you. And that tension runs through every scene. As the group moves deeper into the jungle, the mission begins to fracture. Greed, guilt, and unresolved trauma surface, turning the environment into something volatile. The danger isn't just external, it's internal, and it grows with every step forward. The treasure becomes symbolic, not just of wealth, but of everything left behind, memories, sacrifices, and questions that were never answered. Because in the end, Da 5 Bloods isn't about what was lost in Vietnam. It's about what followed them home, and what was never truly left behind. Some wars don't end. They echo. These films don't just show Vietnam, they expose what it left behind. Stories buried, choices questioned, truths still unsettled. And maybe that's why they're overlooked, because they're harder to watch and even harder to forget. The real question is, how many more stories like these were never told?
Them Nazis weren't no punk.